The silver fork in Chinenye's hand felt heavier than it should. It was perfectly balanced, polished to a mirror shine, and meant for a piece of expensive sea base.
Yes, boss.
But to Chinenye, it felt like a cold metal weight. She placed it precisely 2 inches from the edge of the table, her movements smooth and practiced. To the man sitting there, she was just a waitress in a crisp white shirt. To her, he was a target in a room full of open doors. Zhang Wujin sat at the center of the lounge, surrounded by the soft glow of golden lamps. He was the son of this small, wealthy universe. He moved with the quiet confidence of a man who owned the air he breathed. He took a sip of wine, his eyes scanning the room, but he wasn't looking for what Chinenye saw. He saw prestige. She saw the geometry of a kill. She moved to the next table, her footsteps silent on the thick carpet. As she refilled a water glass, she performed a mental sweep of the room. It was a habit she couldn't break, a relic from her life before the breach. Her eyes moved in a rhythmic pattern: exit, shadow, blind spot. Zhang's personal bodyguards were stationed at the corners of the suite. They looked impressive in their dark suits, but Chinenye noticed the small failures. One guard was leaning too heavily on his left foot. Another was distracted by a woman laughing at the bar. They were looking for a loud threat, a man with a visible gun. They weren't looking at the way the service elevator had stayed on the penthouse floor for 3 seconds too long. Chinenye leaned in to clear a plate, her face a mask of calm. She could smell the expensive jasmine perfume of the lounge, but beneath it, she smelled the ozone of the air conditioning unit as it hummed and then died. The silence was a physical weight. Zhang Wujin leaned back, laughing at something his companion said. He was vulnerable. His back was to the large glass partition that separated the private suite from the main hallway. In a tactical sense, he was sitting in a fishbowl. Chinenye's heart began to beat a little faster, a steady drum against her ribs. She saw the gaps in the security like holes in a net. The guards were too far apart. The manager, Victor, had disappeared from the floor 5 minutes ago. She walked back toward the kitchen, her mind counting the seconds. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was a soldier measuring the distance between the table and the door. She knew the lull was over. The silverware was laid, the wine was poured, and the trap was set. She looked at Zhang one last time, a man who had no idea the world was about to break around him. Chinenye gripped the edge of her serving tray, her knuckles turning white, as she prepared for the sound she knew was coming. The penthouse was quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that felt like a held breath. Chinenye stood near the kitchen doors, her tray held tight against her side. Her eyes remained fixed on the silver doors of the service elevator at the far end of the hallway. Most people in the lounge were focused on their expensive meals and the sparkling city lights outside the windows. They didn't hear the soft, mechanical hum of the elevator rising. They didn't hear the heavy thud as the lift locked into place on the top floor. But Chinenye heard it. She felt the vibration in the soles of her shoes. The elevator doors slid open with a hiss. It wasn't a food delivery or a fresh stack of linens. 6 men stepped out. They didn't move like guests. They moved like a single machine. They wore dark suits that looked sharp and expensive, but their faces were as hard as stone. Leading them was a man with cold, pale eyes and a scar that ran thin across his jaw. This was Seo Kongmin. He didn't look around with wonder at the beautiful lounge. He looked at Zhang Wujin's table like a hunter looks at a target. Chinenye looked for Victor, the restaurant manager. Usually, Victor would be at the front, greeting anyone who stepped off the lift with a polite smile and a bow. But the podium was empty. The hallway was clear. There were no chairs in the way, no cleaning carts, nothing to slow the men down. A cold shiver ran down Chinenye's spine. She realized then that the path hadn't just been left open by mistake. It had been cleared on purpose. Victor hadn't just stepped away for a break. He had stepped away to let the wolves in. The realization was chilling. The person who was supposed to keep this place safe had opened the back door for the killers. Seo Kongmin reached into his jacket. The movement was slow and steady. The other 5 men followed his lead, their hands moving toward the hidden holsters beneath their coats. The wealthy diners were still laughing, their forks clicking against porcelain plates, completely unaware that the air in the room had just turned deadly. Chinenye saw one of Zhang's bodyguards turn his head. For a second, the guard's eyes met Seo's. The guard's face went pale, and his hand moved toward his radio. But he was too slow. The 6 men were already Chinenye out, taking their positions with professional speed. They weren't just here to talk. They were here to finish a job, and they had been given the keys to the kingdom. Chinenye dropped her tray. The loud clang of metal hitting the floor echoed through the lounge, cutting through the music and the chatter. It was a mistake a clumsy waitress would make, but for Chinenye, it was the only way to break the spell of the room. She needed everyone to look. She needed the world to wake up before the first shot was fired. As the tray spun on the carpet, Chinenye didn't run for the kitchen. She didn't hide behind the bar. Instead, she took a long, deep breath and stepped toward the glass doors of the private suite. She knew the weight of her past was heavy, but the weight of what was about to happen was even heavier. The lull was officially over, and the storm had arrived. As the tray settled into a final, shivering stop on the floor, the world around Chinenye seemed to slow down. The sound of the metal clatter echoed in her ears, but it wasn't the lounge she saw anymore. For a heartbeat, the golden lights of the Polaris lounge flickered and turned into the harsh, red emergency lights of a high-security bunker. The smell of jasmine was replaced by the sharp, stinging scent of smoke and burnt wires. This was the ghost she had been running from. This was the night of the breach. In her mind, she was back in her tactical gear, her hands steady on a computer console instead of a serving tray. She had been the best, the specialist who could see a threat coming from a mile away. But that night, the enemy hadn't come from a mile away. They had come from inside the system. She remembered the way the monitors had gone dark, one by one, like eyes closing in the night. She remembered the panicked voices of her team over the radio, calling for a backup that would never come because she had been too slow to see the trap. Chinenye, the door. There through the door. A voice had screamed. It was James, her partner, the man who had trusted her more than anyone. She had frozen. For 3 seconds, the longest 3 seconds of her life, she had stared at the screen, trying to understand how her perfect security had failed. Those 3 seconds cost everything. By the time she moved, the room was a storm of glass and fire. She had survived. But her team had been broken, and the blame had landed squarely on her shoulders. The world believed she had let them in. The weight of that failure felt like a mountain on her chest, a debt she could never pay back. That was why she had chosen this lounge. That was why she had chosen to be a trained shadow in a white dress shirt. If she was invisible, she couldn't fail anyone. If she didn't have power, she couldn't make a mistake that cost a life. Being a waitress was her penance. She spent her days making herself small, clearing plates and refilling water, hoping that if she stayed quiet enough, the ghosts would finally leave her alone. But as the smoke of the memory cleared, Chinenye looked at the 6 men stepping onto the lounge floor. The cold eyes of Seo Kongmin were exactly like the eyes of the men from that night. The way Victor had cleared the path was exactly like the way her security system had been shut down from the inside. The fear was there, sharp and hot. But something else was rising up to meet it. It was the part of her she had tried to bury, the protector. She realized that she was standing at another door. Another breach. The past was happening all over again, but this time, she wasn't staring at a screen. She was the barrier. She wouldn't wait 3 seconds this time. She wouldn't let the fire start. Chinenye straightened her back, the neat bun of her hair feeling tight and restrictive. The girl who wanted to hide was gone. The specialist was back, and she knew that the only way to stop running from her past was to stand her ground in the present. The calm of the lounge broke like a dropped mirror. As the first gunman raised his weapon, the room exploded into a mess of noise. Chairs scraped harshly against the floor. Plates of half-eaten food were knocked over, and the sound of screaming filled the air. The wealthy guests, who only moments ago were laughing, were now scrambling like frightened birds. They pushed past each other, desperate to reach the back exits, their faces pale with a terror they had never known. Chinenye did not run with them. While the world rushed away from the danger, she moved toward it. She stepped into the center of the large glass doorway that led to Zhang Wujin's private area. Her movements were not fast or panicked. They were steady and certain. She planted her feet wide on the carpet, finding her balance. Then, she slowly spread her arms out to her sides. She looked like a bird of prey protecting its nest, or a cross drawn in the sand. Her white server's shirt was bright and clean against the dark wood of the lounge. In the dim light, she knew she looked like a perfect target. She was the only thing standing between the 6 hitmen and the man at the table behind her. Zhang Wujin had stood up, his face filled with shock, but Chinenye didn't look back at him. Her focus was entirely on the men in front of her. The hitmen slowed down. They hadn't expected this. They were prepared for guards with guns and radios, not a waitress with nothing but her own body. Seo Kongmin stopped just a few feet away. He looked at Chinenye with a mixture of confusion and cold anger. He raised his black pistol, the barrel pointing directly at her chest. Chinenye didn't blink. She didn't tremble. She looked Seo straight in the eyes, her gaze as sharp as a blade. It was a challenge. She was telling him without words that if he wanted the man behind her, he would have to go through her first. The quiet penance she had lived for years was over. The woman who wanted to be invisible had decided to be seen by everyone. The glass of the doorway felt cool against her back. She could feel the vibration of the hitman's heavy footsteps on the floor. Behind her, the lounge was a storm of fleeing people and overturned tables, but in this small space between her and the assassins, everything was deathly still. Chinenye stood as unyielding as a stone wall, her shadow stretching long across the floor, waiting for the storm to break. 6 barrels stared at Chinenye, their dark circles like empty eyes waiting for a signal. The air in the lounge felt thick and hard to breathe. Seo Kongmin took a step forward, the metal of his gun glinting under the golden lights. He was a man used to people screaming or begging when they saw him. He expected this woman to break, to cry, or to step aside so he could finish his job. He leaned in close, his voice a low, jagged whisper that sounded like dry leaves on pavement. "Move, little girl," Seo said. His eyes narrowed. "You are just a server. You don't have to die for a man who doesn't even know your name. Get out of the way, and I might let you live to see tomorrow." The men behind him shifted, their fingers tightening on their triggers. They were restless, like wolves waiting for the command to strike. Any other person would have fainted or fled, but Chinenye felt a strange, cold peace wash over her. The fear was gone, replaced by the iron-hard focus of the specialist she used to be. She didn't look like a waitress anymore. Her posture was straight, her shoulders were square, and her eyes held a power that made Seo pause. "You're late, Kongmin," Chinenye said. Her voice wasn't shaking. It was deep and steady, filled with a cold authority that sliced through the noise of the panicking room. Seo froze. The look on his face changed from a sneer to a mask of confusion. He didn't expect her to know his name, and he certainly didn't expect her to speak to him like a superior officer. The service elevator took 4 seconds too long to cycle. She continued, her voice sounding like a commander on a battlefield. "The security cameras on this floor were looped at 8:05 p.m. And your men, they're standing in the wrong formation. You have a blind spot on your left flank that a rookie could exploit. You aren't as good as they say you are." The hitmen behind Seo looked at each other, their confidence wavering. They saw a woman in a white shirt, but they heard a soldier who knew their every move before they even made it. She wasn't just standing there, she was deconstructing them. "I have seen men like you in every corner of the world," Chinenye said, her gaze never leaving Seo's. "You think a gun makes you the master of this room. But I am the door, and I am locked. You aren't going through me, and you aren't going around me. Every second you spend talking to me is a second you lose." Seo Kongmin's face twisted with rage. He was embarrassed that a server was talking down to him. He pressed the barrel of his gun against her forehead, the cold metal biting into her skin. But Chinenye didn't flinch. She stared right through the gun and into his soul. She was one woman against 6 hitmen, but in that moment, she was the one in control. She had found her purpose again, and no amount of lead or steel could make her move. The air in the lounge felt like it was about to snap. Seo Kongmin's finger started to squeeze the trigger, and Chinenye felt the cold weight of the gun against her skin. She didn't close her eyes. She wanted to see the end. But before the hammer could fall, a new sound cut through the silence of the standoff. It wasn't a scream or a plate breaking. It was the heavy, rhythmic thud of combat boots and the unmistakable click-clack of a shotgun being readied. "Drop the weapons. Now." The voice was loud, rough, and familiar. From the main entrance, a man stepped into the light. He wore a rumpled tan jacket and a silver badge that caught the glow of the lamps. It was Detective James Holloway. Behind him, a line of officers moved into the room, their guns raised and their eyes sharp. For a second, the entire lounge turned into a frozen picture. On one side stood the 6 hitmen, their dark suits and modern pistols looking sharp and dangerous. On the other side stood the police, their blue uniforms a wall of law and order. And right in the middle, still standing with her arms spread wide like a living shield, was Chinenye. The tension was so high it felt like electricity in the air. The Mafia hitmen didn't lower their guns. Instead, they shifted their aim, some pointing at the police and some staying fixed on Chinenye. James Holloway's eyes scanned the room until they landed on the waitress in the white shirt. His jaw dropped. He hadn't seen Chinenye in years. Not since the night everything went wrong. He thought she was a ghost, a memory of a failure he couldn't forget. Chinenye, James whispered, his voice cracking with shock. What are you doing? Get down. I'm not moving, James, she replied, her voice steady and calm. She didn't look back at him. She couldn't. If she moved, the balance would break. If she moved, the hitmen would fire, the police would react, and the room would turn into a graveyard. Seo Kongmin laughed. A dry and hateful sound. So, the ghost has a name, he hissed. He looked at the police, and then back at the woman in front of him. You're in a bad spot, detective. If you shoot, you might hit your friend. If we shoot, we definitely hit her. Everyone is stuck because of one stubborn waitress. The standoff was a perfect, deadly circle. The police couldn't move forward without risking Chinenye's life. The hitmen couldn't finish their job because Chinenye was blocking the only way to Jiang Wujin. The powerful man at the table behind her remained silent, watching this server protect him with a loyalty he had never seen in his own world. Seconds felt like hours. James Holloway's hands were shaking slightly on his weapon. He was seeing the past all over again. A door, a breach, and a woman he cared about in the line of fire. But this time, Chinenye wasn't the one who had failed. She was the one holding the world together. She stood perfectly still, a bridge between two sides that wanted to destroy each other, waiting for someone to make the first move in a game where no one could win. The silence of the standoff was suddenly broken by a frantic sound coming from the kitchen. It was the sound of heavy breathing and the scuff of leather shoes on the tile floor. Victor Alvarez, the restaurant manager, stumbled out into the lounge. His bow tie was crooked, and his face was slick with sweat. He wasn't looking at the police or the hitmen. He was looking at the service elevator, desperate to reach it and disappear. Victor, Detective Holloway shouted, his voice echoing like a crack of thunder. The manager froze. He looked at the line of police officers, then at Seo Kongmin, and finally at Jiang Wujin, who was still sitting at the table behind Chinenye. Jiang's eyes, usually as calm as a deep lake, were now burning with a cold, dark fury. He slowly stood up, his expensive suit jacket hanging perfectly on his shoulders. He didn't look like a victim anymore. He looked like a king who had just discovered a snake in his palace. You, Jiang said, his voice low and dangerous. I trusted you to run this lounge. I paid for your loyalty. I paid for your protection. Victor's knees began to shake. He looked at the hitmen, hoping for help. But Seo Kongmin didn't even glance at him. To the assassins, Victor was just a tool that had already been used. They said they would kill me, Mr. Jiang. Victor stammered, his voice thin and high. They said if I didn't clear the guards and loop the cameras, I wouldn't live to see the morning. I had no choice. There is always a choice, Chinenye said, her voice cutting through Victor's excuses. She didn't turn her head. But her words were heavy with the weight of her own past. She knew what it felt like to be scared, but she also knew what it felt like to stand for something. As Victor began to sob, the truth spilled out like blood from a wound. He hadn't just been scared, he had been greedy. He confessed to the secret meetings in the basement and the bags of cash he had taken from Seo's men. He had sold out the most powerful man in the city for a pile of money and a promise of safety. Jiang Wujin listened in silence, his face turning into a mask of stone. He realized that his own empire was rotting from the inside. His guards had been bribed, his manager had betrayed him, and his world was falling apart. Then, Jiang looked at the back of the waitress who was still standing between him and the guns. He saw the way her white shirt was stretched tight across her shoulders. He saw the way she didn't flinch, even when the manager's confession made the hitmen restless. He realized that the only person in the entire room who wasn't asking for money, power, or mercy was the woman he had treated like a ghost for months. She was saving his life for no price at all. She wasn't doing it for a reward. She was doing it because it was who she was. The chaos of the betrayal had shifted the energy in the room. The hitmen were losing their edge, and the police were closing in. In the middle of it all, Chinenye remained the anchor. She was the only truth in a room full of lies. The shadow had finally stepped into the light, and for the first time in years, the debt she felt she owed began to feel a little lighter. The tension in the room finally snapped, but not with a bang. As more sirens wailed in the streets below, Seo Kongmin realized his window of time had closed. He looked at Chinenye one last time, a look of frustrated respect, and slowly lowered his weapon. The other hitmen followed his lead. They were professionals, and they knew when a job had turned into a suicide mission. Within minutes, the police moved in, the cold metal of handcuffs clicking into place. And the lounge was filled with the frantic energy of an investigation. Chinenye finally let her arms drop to her sides. They felt heavy like lead weights, and her muscles began to shake from the effort of holding the world apart. She walked away from the glass door, her footsteps heavy on the carpet. She wanted to disappear into the kitchen, to go back to being a shadow, but a soft voice stopped her. Wait. Zhang Wujin was standing by the window. The city lights glowed behind him, making him look like a powerful king in a dark castle. He signaled for his remaining guards to stay back. He walked toward Chinenye, his eyes searching her face. For the first time, he didn't look at her like a servant. He looked at her as an equal. You saved my life, Zhang said, his voice quiet but strong. My own people, men I have known for years, sold me for a price. But you, a woman I never even thanked for a cup of coffee, stood in the gap. You have the soul of a warrior and the heart of a saint. He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her. I am a man who rewards loyalty. I have a seat at my table for someone like you. I can give you power, money, and a name that people will fear and respect. You would never have to clear a plate again. You could be the shield of my empire. I am offering you a throne, Chinenye. Chinenye looked at his hand, which was extended toward her. It was an invitation to a world of luxury and strength, a way to never feel small again. For a moment, she thought about it. She thought about the safety that came with being on the winning side of a man like Zhang. But then, she thought about the breach and the ghosts of her past. She realized that joining Zhang's world would just be another way of hiding. I don't want a throne, Chinenye said, her voice clear and firm. She looked him in the eye, her gaze steady. I spent a long time trying to be invisible because I was ashamed of who I was. If I take your offer, I'm just trading one mask for another. I don't want to be a shadow in your world. I want to be the light in my own. Zhang's expression shifted. He wasn't used to being told no, but he didn't look angry. He looked surprised. He realized that the woman in front of him couldn't be bought. Her loyalty wasn't for sale because it didn't belong to him. It belonged to her own sense of right and wrong. I'm choosing the truth, she continued. I'm going to clear my name. I'm going to stop running. Zhang Wujin bowed his head slightly, a gesture of deep respect. Then you are braver than anyone I have ever met, he said. He watched as she turned away, walking toward Detective Holloway. Chinenye didn't look back at the expensive lounge or the powerful man. She walked toward the police line, ready to tell her story, finally understanding that the only life worth saving was the one she could live with her head held high. The weeks that followed the hit were loud and busy, but Chinenye did not hide. Instead of fading away, she sat in bright rooms with Detective James Holloway, laying out the truth like pieces of a puzzle. She gave him the names, the dates, and the technical details of the old security breach that had ruined her life. With James's help, the lies that had been told about her began to crumble. The people who had blamed her for their own mistakes were brought into the light, and slowly, the heavy weight of shame lifted from her shoulders. Her name was finally clear. She was no longer a failure or a ghost. She was Chinenye Obioma, a woman who had stood her ground when everyone else ran. A few months later, the Polaris lounge looked different. The broken glass had been replaced, and the smell of smoke was completely gone. But the biggest change was the woman standing at the entrance. Chinenye was no longer wearing the white server's shirt or the tight, restrictive bun. Her hair was free, and she wore a sharp, dark suit that fit her like armor. After the trial, Zhang Wujin had helped her with the paperwork, not as a boss, but as a person paying a debt of life. Now the lounge didn't just have her protection, it had her name on the deed. She stood by the same glass door where she had once spread her arms to stop 6 gunmen. The sun was setting over the city, turning the sky into a sea of orange and purple. She watched the new staff move through the room. They worked with pride because they knew their leader was someone who would never leave them behind. She had turned the lounge into a true sanctuary, a place where people could feel safe because the person in charge knew exactly what it cost to stay that way. James Holloway walked up to the door, a small smile on his face. He didn't look at her like a victim anymore. and he didn't look at her like a waitress. He looked at her with the respect of a partner. He nodded toward the city lights, and then at the door she was guarding. "It looks good, Chinenye," he said quietly. "A real sanctuary." "It's a start," she replied, her voice filled with a peace she hadn't felt in years. As James walked inside, Chinenye stayed at the threshold for a moment longer. She looked at her reflection in the glass. She saw a woman who was no longer making herself small to avoid the ghosts of the past. She was a protector, a leader, and most importantly, she was herself. She reached out and touched the cool glass of the door. It was no longer just a suggestion or a barricade. It was hers. She turned away from the sunset and stepped into the light of her new life, ready for whatever the future might bring.